This occurred while I was a small child. At the age of 8 or so, my parents had me. Late, both of my older siblings are at least 10 times my senior in age. I awoke. Awake in the wee hours of the morning to a noise from the lower level one evening. It was my parents. I opened my door a crack and overheard my folks becoming agitated about something I had no idea what. I went to the stairs and stood there. Calling down, my mom's father at the top reached the base of the steps and told me to return to bed. I paid attention. I could do so without posing any queries. You could tell they were anxious about something even though I tried to return. I listened to my mother and went back to sleep when I heard the front door downstairs slam shut. I assumed they had left the house, but I wasn't sure why. Eventually, I woke up to sounds downstairs once more. This time, it was the sound of the front door closing followed by footsteps, but there was no talking, so I assumed they were back home and were just being quiet so they wouldn't wake me up. I occasionally heard footsteps and thuds from. I sat up and did not move when I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, getting louder and closer until they reached the top, and then made their way to my door. I heard drawers and cabinets being opened and closed downstairs, and I was positive I heard the refrigerator opening too. I assumed it was my older brother Chris, who is 10 years older than me, and at the time he was already driving, so he was going out and coming home late, so him getting home at like 2 in the morning and rummaging the fridge wasn't abnormal at all. I was lying down with my eyes open, facing the door. Since there were no lights on outside my room, anyone walking around had to do so in the dark. All I saw was a black mass in my doorway that resembled a person's head. I called out everyone's name, starting with Chris, Mom, and Dad, and they didn't answer. They simply closed the door, leaving me confused but a little scared. Lower level, after returning home, I was certain that my dad was checking on me, even though I wasn't sure why he was ignoring me. I let my curiosity get the better of me and went downstairs in the dark, turning out all the lights as I went. I stopped at the doorway and saw a tall figure standing in the middle of the kitchen. I said, "Dad," assuming it was him based only on the person's size. A deep voice uttered, returning upstairs. I ran to my room, closed the door, and dove under the covers. All I could think was, why did my dad's voice sound like that? My parents' voices were echoing from downstairs, and I hadn't realized that there was a stranger in the house until a few moments later. When I went back to the top of the stairs, they were surprised to see that I was still awake. I asked them what had happened, and they said that Chris had had a minor accident but would be okay. A month later, I learned that Chris had gotten. When my dad got into a car accident and drove in a condition he shouldn't have been driving in, my parents received a call from the hospital and hurried to see him right away, leaving me to sleep. When I asked my dad if he had been in my room earlier, I found out that they had been gone for hours, and my mom freaked out and yelled at him for forgetting to lock the door. Hastily leaving the house, my parents told me that they felt like idiots for leaving me alone and leaving the door unlocked. I don't think anything of value was stolen, even though the person who broke into the house obviously didn't intend to harm me having a gun. After I told my parents about the person at my bedroom door and in the kitchen, my dad searched the house with his gun and my mom called the police. The last thing I really remember is being asked by a police officer to give my story. It was around 2013 or 2014, and my brother was about 7 or 8 at the time. We had recently moved into a new house to be closer to school and for cheaper rent. All things considered, it was a pretty nice house, and it even had a cozy fireplace for the winter. Anyway, my brother was really into Batman and had this Batman car that if a button was pressed made noises and lit up. It was basically his favorite toy, so he played with it often. After he came inside one afternoon from playing outside, he told us he had found something. My mom and I asked what it was, and he pointed out a picture of a young boy in the shape of one of those tags you get if your parents paid extra for school photos. The picture was filthy and so old that you couldn't see the year it was taken. We thought, okay, some parent lost their kid's picture, no big deal. Then my brother said something that confused me. "Hey, buddy." I looked at him with a look that essentially asked him to repeat himself. Said, "Hey buddy, I'm your friend." I shrugged it off, figuring he'd made friends with the next door neighbors or something, and he somehow got the school picture as like a keepsake that night around 3 in the morning. The main reason this confused me was because my brother didn't make friends easily, and he had no friends that I knew of. This buddy only came up once we had moved. The residence was dozing off. After my brother started talking when I woke up, I went into his room to tell him to stop, or else he would wake up our parents. It was strange because when I walked into his room, he was sitting up straight in bed, acting as though he was talking to someone other than himself or his toys. I told him to stop talking, and I went to bed myself. A few days later, my mom was asking me about my brother and asked if I had seen him get up at night. I said that I had woken up to him talking a few nights ago, but that was the only reason. He was acting strangely, but we both shrugged it off as him being a child. In my room, my bed was directly across from my door, so if I turned over, I could see into the hallway in front of me. One night I woke up to use the restroom, and since I'm still terrified of the dark, I left the hallway light on, figuring my dad would turn it off once he got up, and I would probably be asleep by then. Then, as I was lying in my bed, I got up to tell my brother that he shouldn't be playing with his damn Batman car this late, but when I got to his room, he was asleep in his bed with a toy on the floor across the room, still making noise. I walked over to turn it off, and I was finally able to fall back asleep, but the next few days, my brother wouldn't stop talking about Buddy, and it was honestly starting to freak me out. So I went over to the neighbors' houses to the right. Unoccupied, this began to worry me, but my dad assured me that it was probably just an imaginary friend he had made up. I agreed to this because I couldn't think of anything else to do, but practically every night, one of us, my mom, dad, or sister, would say we heard my brother's toy making noise and that I needed to go into the room and turn it off. I explained that I had to do it too, and that night brought up the fact that my brother was talking to someone again. My dad also insisted that the toy was probably motion activated, even though there was no advertisement for motion activation when we bought it. We're so frightened by it that we began sharing a bed in my room. I'm glad we did this because otherwise I would have dismissed it as a nightmare. My sister and I were chatting, trying to keep each other calm and cheerful, when we heard the horrible sound of my brother's toy. We both turned to face my brother, who was in the room directly across from mine, and were horrified to see our brother's toy rolling past the door on its own. We screamed and ran to our parents' room, where they became angry with our brother, accusing him of playing a cruel joke on us while we were there. Already terrified, his words sent shivers down my spine. I wasn't Bud wanted to play that evening, so we put the toy in the trash and took out the batteries. My sister and I were relieved until the following day, when my brother found the toy again. Our parents accused him of taking it out of the trash, to which he replied, "Buddy got it for me." The toy was broken into small pieces and thrown away for the last time. Our brother was clearly upset, but everything worked out when our parents got him a new Batman figurine. It wasn't until a week or so later, when we all thought everything was all right, and that friend had left, that my mom had come into the living room to ask us a question while she was cooking chicken breasts on the countertop George Foreman grill. When we opened the kitchen door, we saw the George Foreman grill halfway across the room, as if it had been thrown. My mom insisted it wasn't anywhere near the edge, and my dad hadn't. Justifications, nothing happened after that, and we moved out about a year later, but I still wonder if my brother's imaginary friend Buddy wasn't music imaginary when I was only 10 years old. We also moved to a new house in a different town, and I had to start over as a 5th grader at a new elementary school, which is never easy. At first, it was a little awkward because everyone knew each other, and I was just some random kid walking into the room. At my elementary school, you were required to eat lunch with the other students in your class, and I still remember that. Being extremely uncomfortable kids at that age are very judgmental, so it was harder for me to make friends in the first few days of school. However, during those first few days of being the new kid on the block, I actually got to know a few of the other kids. Dan, for example, attended a private school, so we went to different schools. I met Dan while riding my bike down the street, and he asked if I had recently moved into the house on the corner. We started hanging out from there, and a few days later I was surprised when my parents called me to the door and introduced me to Alex. He said he lived down the block and asked if I liked video games, to which I naturally replied in the affirmative. He then invited me over to his house to play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Even though I didn't own that game, I really wanted it, so I said yes. We strolled to his house, which was literally the corner house at the other end of the block. As soon as we arrived, I thought the house was run down and neglected. It was the same size as most of the other houses on the block. There was also no grass. He led us to the basement, which smelled like 15 cats. The front yard consisted of just 2 large patches of dirt, with a walkway cutting through them to the front door. The inside of the house was just as messy, with hoarders' boxes and junk everywhere. Lived down there strangely, there didn't seem to be any pets, and the basement, which may have been the messiest room in the house, was a pig farm. We sat on this brown leather couch in front of the TV. He had a GameCube and a PS2, and we played San Andreas in 2-player mode. It was enjoyable, and at that moment I thought I would end up liking Alex and wanting to be friends with him. However, when I said I had to go, he seemed really disappointed, as though he wanted to stay. We had already played for about 2 hours. I just wanted to go home, so I followed him around the house until I said, "See you later." This was the first indication that Alex was weird, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. The next day, Alex rang the doorbell again and asked my parents if I could play again. This time we played GameCube in my room for about an hour. I don't mean to sound harsh, but I was beginning to grow uncomfortable with him because I felt like he was weird and that he made me feel uneasy with how physically close he got to me. That same day, I rode my bike up to Dan's house to see if he could hang out. He was down, so we started riding our bikes further up the block. This was a mistake because as we passed Alex's house, he came outside onto his front stoop as if he were waiting by the window. It was weird, but it was also awkward because I had just had my mom tell him that I was sick. Dan left, and I would honestly prefer hang out with him because I just liked him more. Spent time with that child, and I thought he was kind of strange. I learned from Dan that Alex was actually a few years older than me, at the age of 12. At this point, I decided to avoid him. The following weekend, Alex knocked on our door again, asking for me. I had previously told my mom to tell him I'm not home if he came back, so she did. However, late that night, I woke up to my window completely open and a cool breeze blowing into the room. It was a chilly September night, so I most definitely left the window closed. The first time I woke up to an unexpected breeze, I wondered who could have done it. Then, I felt something poke my foot, so I screamed. When I looked at the foot of my bed, I saw Alex. He told me to be quiet, it was just him. Before I could even ask why he was in my room, he explained that his parents were fighting, and he wanted to sleep with me. I was shocked, so I told him to leave. He begged me to let him sleep in bed with me once more. Unsettling scene 1 locked the window and went straight to my parents to wake them up and tell them that Alex had done something crazy. When my parents returned the next day, they said it didn't go well and that Alex's crazy mother had screamed and laughed in their faces, taking no responsibility for her son's actions. I'm sure my parents didn't want to call the police because Alex was still a young child, but a few nights later, I woke up to knocks at my window. I had my blinds closed, but I knew it was Alex because I didn't answer. I even heard someone try to open the window for a few minutes. I think my parents weren't as threatened because, as I mentioned earlier, Alex was just a kid. It was probably a few days later when Dan and I, along with another kid I made friends with from school, were biking from my house down the block, and I saw Alex run to the window as we passed, and he just watched. I told my friends about what happened, and they found it hilarious and up my alley. I was actually scared. I remember my heart racing. Eventually, of course, the knock stopped. I went to tell my parents, and they told me to just ignore it. That night, my dad heard something in my room that made me scream like a girl. Alex was climbing through the window through the closed blinds. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, but by then, Alex had already returned outside. My dad went outside and chased him all the way back to his house, but Al managed to get inside before my dad could catch up to him. My dad then pounded on the door until Alex's parents opened up. My dad said that Alex sounds like someone who would live in a disgusting house like that. I never heard from Alex again, though I did see him once or twice in front of his house over the next few years while driving by. Thankfully, the family eventually moved somewhere else. I believe there's a chance Alex was looking to do something crazy like murder me, or at the very least attack me, just because he saw me hanging with other kids when I was younger. And my dad must have said something right, because he somehow managed to persuade Alex's parents to pay for the window if he didn't involve the police. Didn't want to be his friend, I mean, what else would he do after smashing through my window and crawling inside? I'm afraid to think about the kind of person Alex turned out to be.